Hey, welcome back. This is Chapter 7 on climate change, and there's some things that I'm just going to skip over in my presentation here. They're not as important. Really, there's a couple things that are going to be important. Proxy data is going to be incredibly important. Greenhouse gases are going to be incredibly important. Positive and negative feedback loops are going to be incredibly important. Adaptation and mitigation is going to be incredibly important, but there's big chunks that I'm just going to blow by the slides, and I'll let you know. I'm skipping these slides because ultimately I don't think they're as important as they were when I wrote the chapter. So let's jump in. This is Greenland. This is a place in Greenland that the photographer calls the Grand Canyon. This is the result of melting ice. It probably looks worse than it is. Rather, it probably is worse than it looks. Massive, massive changes in the Arctic, in the Antarctic. Let's ignore that. What are we going to talk about? How do we know about past climates? The answer is proxy data, and I'm going to talk a lot about proxy data. Why is climate change in the past? Milankovitch cycles, Earth-Sun orbital relationships, axial precession, and the shape of Earth's orbit. That's why it's changed in the past. That's also how we know that we are changing it now. How do we know that the climate is changing now? Because we have records. We can look around and look at temperature over the last 100 years or so. We can look at all kinds of things and look around and just know that the climate is changing. We'll look at exactly some of the things that we know. How do scientists model climate change? With incredibly powerful computers. How are governments and people responding to climate change? For the most part, they're not. We've known since the 1970s that this was going to happen. We've known actually since the 1800s what we were doing. And as a species, we have collectively ignored it because we've been fed a diet of lies and propaganda. And we believe that in order to keep our way of life, we have to destroy the planet, which just isn't true. To make continued profits for the oil and gas companies, we're going to destroy the planet. But we didn't have to, and we shouldn't have. And we would have had better lives if we hadn't. So let's talk about proxy records. Proxy records are records of something that tell you about something else. So if you want to know what the temperature was like on Earth, anytime before around 1880, after 1880, we had reliable thermometers. Prior to 1880, each thermometer would have to be made by hand, and you wouldn't be able to necessarily compare it to the readings taken with another thermometer. So any temperature readings prior to 1880 or so, we have to use what are called proxy records. I think a really good example of what proxy records are would be the movie The Hangover. When they wake up, they have no idea what the hell happened, and they're trying to piece it together using little bits of evidence like, oh, there's a receipt. So the receipt doesn't actually have their pictures and say they were here, but it's a clue. So maybe a good way of thinking of proxy records are they're a clue. So some of the types of data that we consider to be proxy records would be fossil plankton, gas bubbles in ancient ice, ocean bottom sediments, fossil pollen, growth rings in trees, mineral formations in caves, coral reefs. All of those we can examine, and they can tell us about the temperatures at the time when those features were being formed. So, for example, the growth rings in trees, we know which years were wetter, which years were drier, looking at tree rings. So this lady scientist is holding up a sediment core taken from the bottom of the ocean. There's a couple different ways that we can tell what the temperature was at the time that those sediments were being laid down based on the chemical composition of the skeletons of the little microorganisms that were living in the ocean. So we've got ocean bottom sediment cores. Again, more sediment cores from the bottom of the ocean. An ice core. This is the end. This woman was in charge of a drilling project in Antarctica. They get drilled down over 3,000 meters, so over 10,000 feet of ice. This is one of the last sections of the ice core showing bands of dust and debris. So the dust and debris they could also look at, and typically on the ice sheets, if there's more dust, it's because there's less ice, and so more dirt is exposed that gets blown into the air than deposited on the ice. Here is fossil pollen. So fossil pollen is a really, really valuable proxy record because the different species of plants produce pollen that looks really, really different. Like it's, how many are we looking at here? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 completely different species, 8 different species of 9 different species of pollen in this photograph. So looking at the relative relationship, the relative amounts of different types of pollen. So for example, I'm just going to make up stuff, but it might work as an example. Let's pretend that the blue balls are oak pollen and that these big orange things are pine pollen. So in Clear Lake has an excellent fossil pollen record. They take a tube, they push it down into the mud of the lake, they pull up the ocean, or in this case, lake bottom sediment core, and then by looking at them in a microscope at the pollen, they can know how many pollen grains there were from different species. And if you know what species were living there and what the mix was, all you have to do is find a similar mix today, and you know what the climate. So if you, let me back up. Clear Lake, we've got pollen samples. So looking at Clear Lake today, there's a lot of oak pollen and less pine pollen. But if you go back 10,000 years, there would have been way more pine pollen and less oak pollen. And that tells us that the climate was cooler and wetter. And so we could go to a place that has a similar amount of pine to oak pollen. We know what the climate there is now, and that will help us figure out what the climate was like based on the pollen counts in other places. Coral reef. Oh, my favorite description of proxy data is tubes of stuff. So you can see the ocean sediment, they're actually pulled up in a tube. They get sliced in half to expose the layers. The ice cores are pulled up in tubes. The fossil pollen is often pulled up in these sediment cores. You can see there's a rotary drill here. They're taking a sample of the coral reef, and when they pull it up, it's going to be a tube. So it just happens that a lot of the proxy data is recovered in some sort of tubes of stuff, tubes of ice, tubes of dirt with pollen, tubes of coral reef. All of those are very important proxy data that tell us what the temperature, and in the case of ice cores, we can actually study the composition of the gas trapped in the bubbles to know what the carbon dioxide and oxygen levels were in the atmosphere in the past. So more proxy data, sediment from the ocean core sediment, very important lake sediment. This is the JOIDES resolution. This was a ship that the U.S. government operates, and it goes around the world. There's a drilling rig on it. They use that drilling rig to drill down into the bottom of the ocean to retrieve those sediment cores. Here we have a snow pit in Greenland. So you can see the layers of snow as they get deposited year after year after year. And here you can see a cross-section of one of those tubes of ice, of an ice core, showing the bubbles of ancient atmosphere. So this sample would be contaminated, but scientists have figured out ways to sample the gas in these ice cores without contaminating them with the current atmosphere. Isotope analysis in ice cores and in ocean sediments, looking at microorganisms, the little skeletons of microorganisms. Looking at isotope analysis, they can tell us what the temperature was. I've put a link to the Willy Dansgaard. It's also in the climate change video playlist. Willy Dansgaard was a scientist who figured out, based on a cold front moving through, what the oxygen isotope levels were. So at this point, I would say just go watch that video, come back to the lecture slides, and then get on with your life, because the video does a much better job of explaining it with animation than I can. Here we've got O16 and O18. If it's colder, you'd expect more O18 to be dropping out first. If it's warmer, more O18 would be evaporating. Long story short, looking at the relationship of O16 to O18 can tell us what the temperature was at the time that that ice was deposited. Thanks, Willy Dansgaard. Tree rings, they can take samples of tree rings and determine what the climate conditions were like. For example, wider rings indicate better growing conditions, narrow rings, worse, harsher growing conditions. And they can use different tree samples in the same region to create an overlapping record. In the American Southwest, there's a record of tree rings that goes back over 10,000 years because they can match up sections in the tree ring. So that section here matched up with this section from this tree. And then this tree, the oldest parts match the youngest parts of this, and the oldest parts of that match the youngest parts of that. And they, by finding older and older trees, they can leapfrog back and back and back into the past. Let's take a look. Yeah, this is one of those parts, not really super important. As you look at this graph, it's the last 500 million years of Earth's climate. And each of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the time scales are different. The time scale is zoomed in 10 times, zoomed in 10 times, zoomed in 10 times, zoomed in 10 times. So the divisions are 100 million years apart. You can see the temperature goes down and up and down and up. Pretty big swings over long periods of time. Snowball Earth, I'll talk about that in just a minute. So here we have the divisions are 100 million. Now they're 10 million years apart. Here we have the PETM, Paleogene-Eogene thermal maximum. There's this little spike in temperatures that wiped out a lot of species, and many scientists are looking at that as a proxy or as something we can look at to help us understand what we might be looking at with extinction of species as a result of global warming. So about 60 million years ago or so, there was a spike in temperatures very briefly that scientists are looking at and seeing how many species went extinct, and they're using that as a model to help us understand what we could be looking at with extinctions as a result of temperature changes. So here we've got the extinction of the dinosaurs about 64 million years ago. Snowball Earth is a really interesting idea that it's a positive feedback loop. If Earth gets colder, there's more snow, so the albedo goes up, so it's colder, so there's more snow, so the albedo goes up. And eventually, the whole planet just gets covered with ice. And there's nothing to stop it, although scientists now think what happened was volcanic activity. Once Earth was frozen, as Earth was frozen, volcanic activity would have put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and there wouldn't have been plants to absorb the carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide built up and built up and built up, got warm enough, and then it would have triggered a positive feedback loop that would have resulted in the melting of everything. As it gets warmer, you lose the albedo, so it gets warmer, so you lose the ice, so the albedo goes down, so it's warmer, and eventually everything just melts back. But Snowball Earth, I would recommend getting lost down the Wikipedia rabbit hole if you look up Snowball Earth. Okay, so dinosaurs get whacked 65 million years ago, gradual cooling trend. Part of this cooling trend, they think, was the uplift of the uplift of the Himalayas. The uplift of the Himalayas, a lot of the Himalayas are made up of sedimentary rock, which has a lot of calcium in it. When rain falls on rock with calcium, the calcium gets dissolved, and the carbon dioxide in the rain dissolves away the carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide in the rainwater dissolves the calcium, taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So the Himalayas, as they got weathered away by rainfall, absorbed an enormous amount of carbon dioxide, which dropped the temperature of the planet. Totally interesting idea that the weathering of large regional features could have an effect on the climate of a planet. Here we have, now that it's going from 10 million years to 1 million, 5 million, 4, 3, 2 million years ago. Hundreds of thousands of years for the last 2.5 million years or so. Here's the beginning of the Pleistocene, the last ice age, right in there, about 2.5 million years ago. We've been on this cycle, 100,000-year cycles of 10,000 years of warm, and then 90 of cold, 10 warm, 90 cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold. And that is changes in Earth's orbit. That's what's caused these ice ages in the past, and it also lets us know that the current warming isn't natural. The current warming is caused by humans. For example, here is the record of temperature. Here we have temperature and carbon dioxide over the last 800,000 years. You'll notice that CO2, and you'll need to know this, CO2 has gone from 180 parts per million to 280 or 300 parts per million. Over the last million years, CO2 has varied between about 180 parts per million and about 280 parts per million. Right now, it's well over 400. I think it's coming up on like 412 parts per million. It's the highest level of carbon dioxide that Earth has seen in the last 15 million years. There have never been humans, not Neanderthals, not cavemen. There have not been humans on Earth at a time when CO2 levels have been this high. The last time CO2 levels were this high, there were alligators in New York. There were tropical swamps in New York because there was so much CO2 that the temperature was that much higher. That is the world that we are heading toward as the result of the amount of carbon dioxide that humans have put into the atmosphere. Here's the last 1,000 years. You'll notice we went into a general cooling trend, and then it got warm, so we should be going back into a cooling trend. We were starting to cool. Here we have the Industrial Revolution, and carbon dioxide and temperature have gone up and up and up. In fact, this is the hockey stick. This reconstruction was created by Michael Mann. Michael Mann was sued by the fossil fuel industry and accused of lying. He has been cleared. The data is what the data is. This is the hockey stick. The hockey stick is totally legit science, despite the fossil fuel industry's lies that it was faked somehow. The Pleistocene, you need to know this, the Pleistocene began about 2.5 million years ago. The last glacial period, so an ice age, I should back this up. So an ice age isn't a long cold spell. It's a period of time in which you have warm and cold and warm and cold and warm and cold and warm and cold. The warm periods are called interglacial periods, and the cold times are the glacial periods. Interglacial warm, glacial cold. So the last glacial period ended about 1,100 years ago. So the last interglacial started about 1,100 years ago. 1,100, 20,000 years, 10 to 20,000 years ago is when the last interglacial started. 10 to 20,000 years ago is when the last glacial period stopped. And we've been warming steadily since. So here we've got the last 20,000 years showing the blue line is amount of snow. The red line is temperature, so you can see warmer. And then a warming period. And then a gradual cooling that matches, again, the hockey stick, this gradual cooling. We should be sliding back into a glacial period, but we've put enough CO2 that we're jumping. We're still in an interglacial period. And we've probably pushed off the next glacial period a considerable amount. Don't care. Not as important. Not as important. Boom! This is it. The Milankovitch cycles were thought up by Milutin Milankovitch. He looked at these three factors. The shape of Earth's orbit changes on a cycle of 100,000 years. Our Earth's axis points in a different direction on a cycle of 26,000 years. And the amount of tilt changes on a 41,000 year cycle. So these three, the elliptical orbit on a cycle of 100,000 years, where the axis is pointing changes on a cycle of 26,000 years, and the tilt changes on a 41,000 year cycle. These combine to create these interglacial, glacial, interglacial, glacial cycles that somehow the 100,000, 26,000, and 41,000 year cycles all combine to create this. I've also put at least one movie in the playlist on YouTube for the climate change chapter. I would really recommend watching the animations. The animations explain it in a way that static images don't, and kind of put together how those three variables work together. Also, Milutin Milankovitch was a really interesting guy. He was placed under house arrest by the military. I thought it was World War II. I think it was World War I. And he was working out the math on this by hand. Other reasons that have been proposed for climate change that are not why the climate is changing, one of them would be changes in the amount of energy from the sun. That when there's more sunspots, the sun puts out slightly more energy. But if we look at the amount of energy that the sun puts out, it's less than a watt, the variation. So we're looking at an average of 1,360 watts. When you get a little bit less, it's closer to 1,361. When you get more, it's closer to 1,362. So from 1980 to 2015, that's what the temperatures did, but this is what the amount of energy from the sun did. So it's not changes in energy from the sun. This is just showing where sea level was during the last glacial maximum. About 20,000 years ago, sea level worldwide was 360 feet lower because there was so much more ice. You can see the great ice sheets over the US and Canada, also over Eurasia, over Europe. There was so much ice that sea levels were lower by about 360 feet. So you could walk all the way from Asia down to Papua New Guinea. This is a region called Doggerland. Doggerland is another rabbit hole on Wikipedia I would recommend going down. So roughly 16,000 years ago, this was all dry land. There was no English Channel. You could walk from England to France. It was all dry land. This was slightly higher in elevation, and people were living and farming. And in the 50s and 60s, fishing boats started bringing up objects off of the bottom of the ocean. And they wondered, why antlers? That seems weird to be picking up with a fishing boat. And then they realized, there were people living here 8,000 years ago. 8,000 years ago, there were people living on this land. And as the glaciers melted, the sea level slowly rose up and swallowed what was called Doggerland. Today it's called Dogger Bank. It's a region with really good fishing. Continental positions have a role in climate. So when we had Pangaea 220 million years ago, there would have been more continentality because there was more continent. There's also just one huge ocean. So the warm currents would have been warmer because the currents were able to go around the entire world before they would run into the east coast. So the warm currents would be warmer, the cold currents would be colder, continentality would be more important. The Panama land bridge that happened about 20 million years ago created the Gulf Stream. So 20 million years ago, the warm currents along the Atlantic would have gone from the Atlantic into the Pacific and then kept moving. After the Panama land bridge, the volcanic activity created the Panama land bridge. Those currents then got routed up the East Coast. So the climates of the East Coast are very much a result of the orientation, the configuration of the continents. If the Panama land bridge wasn't there, the climate of the American Southeast would be very different because you wouldn't have such a warm body of water. Mechanisms of natural climate change. Volcanic eruptions usually drop the temperature for a couple of years. Here's 4 different eruptions: Santa Maria, Agung, Pinatubo. This is Mount Pinatubo erupting in 1991. They increase the albedo, they decrease insolation, so they decrease the temperature for a couple years. Other volcanic eruptions, the Long Valley caldera erupted about 760,000 years ago, and the ash fall covered about half the U.S. It, in fact, there was so much ash falling, it suffocated a woolly rhinoceros in Nebraska, which is really, really interesting. Volcanic ash is glass. It's not ash like wood or paper ash that's very fragile. It's spiky and sharp and really does a lot of lung damage. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the climate feedbacks. And the feedbacks that I'm aware of, they're almost all positive feedback loops that are making global warming worse. So let's look at some of them. There's the ice albedo feedback. It's a positive feedback loop. Ice melts, which exposes dark ocean, which absorbs energy, which gets warm, which melts the ice, which absorbs more heat. So instead of having high albedo ice, you have low albedo water, which absorbs heat, which gets warmer, which melts the ice, so you have more water. And every lecture, I'd hit this slide and think, what the hell? Why do I have a slide of what looks like a lava flow in Hawaii? And then I remember, oh shit, no. This is the edge of the ice sheet in Greenland, and this is all smoke and dust and soot and black carbon from shipping. Here we've got an aerial view. I always expect ice sheets to be white, like snow, like ice, but often they're quite dark, which then messes up the albedo, which makes them melt more quickly. There's a group on Twitter you can follow, and in fact, I've put one of their videos in the climate change video playlist on YouTube. It's called Black and Bloom, and the black refers to the black carbon from shipping. As the ice melts in the Arctic, there's more commercial shipping traffic. The shipping traffic has exhaust that's black, like the black diesel smoke that lands on the ice that melts the ice. So there's more water, so there's more ships, so there's more black carbon, so there's less ice, so there's more water, so there's more ships. And the other part of Black and Bloom is bloom, that there's algae that grow in the ice, and the algae create pigments to protect themselves from ultraviolet light. Those pigments absorb heat and melt the ice. So there's a couple positive feedback loops going on in the Arctic right now. Both of them, all of them are acting to warm the planet and decrease ice cover. Another view of the ice sheet showing the cracks where you can see the white ice underneath the black carbon. The water vapor feedback is another positive feedback loop. Water vapor is the most abundant greenhouse gas. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. So higher temperatures result in more evaporation. More evaporation leads to more water vapor in the atmosphere. More water vapor in the atmosphere warms the atmosphere, so there's more evaporation, so there's more water vapor, so it's hotter. So there's more evaporation, so there's more water vapor, so it's hotter. And the results of this, the evidence for this would be higher precip events, more flooding, more big storms, more big hurricanes. And Hurricane Harvey, that was over Houston, that set records. I think 40% of the extra rain from Harvey they have attributed to climate change. So the whole storm wasn't the result of climate change, but I think roughly 40% of the extra rain in Hurricane Harvey was from climate change. This should be like a graduate level seminar, Earth's carbon budget. It's incredibly complicated. I'll try to simplify it. And here's the parts you need to know. When we're looking at carbon, we're looking at carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we're looking at carbon in plants in the form of sugar, in the form of carbohydrates. And when we're talking about carbon, there's sources. So the burning of fossil fuels would be a source of carbon. There's places where the carbon is stored. Those are called sinks. So when plants absorb carbon dioxide and make sugar and more plant, that carbon dioxide has been taken out of the atmosphere and now it's part of the plant. So now it's a sink. And flux refers to carbon going back and forth between different sinks. So there's sinks, reservoirs. Flux is the carbon moving between the sinks. The amount of carbon that moves is 1/10 to 100th of the carbon in sinks. So it's kind of, most of the carbon is just sitting there, and a tiny bit moves back and forth from one place to another. There's human impacts. We burn fossil fuels. That increases the carbon that's floating around. We clear forests. That increases carbon dioxide. The oceans absorb a lot of our carbon dioxide, so a lot of the carbon dioxide produced by humans is being absorbed by the oceans, which is good because it keeps it out of the atmosphere, but it's bad because it also creates problems in the ocean. Ocean acidification, as the water absorbs carbon dioxide, it makes the water more acidic, which changes the chemistry of the water, which is causing problems for microorganisms. This is called ocean acidification. More CO2 in the atmosphere means that plants are growing more quickly. We know this. This is a good thing. Although, as the temperatures continue to increase, the plant's ability to photosynthesize will decrease. So, as the temperature in CO2 goes up, the plants initially get a boost from the higher CO2 in the atmosphere, so they grow faster. But as the temperatures continue to rise, the plants will eventually grow more slowly and eventually start actually being producers of carbon dioxide, not absorbers. So on this diagram, this is all of the carbon that we know about. The numbers in yellow are the carbon in flux. The numbers in white, so in gigatons, which is 1 billion tons. So there's 10,000 gigatons of carbon locked up in fossil fuels, 6,000 gigatons of carbon in sediments in the ocean, 40,000 in seawater, 2 gigatons in ocean sediment. The numbers in red are from humans. So Plants every year are taking 120 gigatons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and making it into plants. They're absorbing another 3 gigatons because humans have put that into the atmosphere. So there's another 3 gigatons of plant growth, but 60 and 60 is 120. So plants are taking up 120 gigatons. Every year plants release 120. Dead plants getting broken down release 120 gigatons. Same thing with the oceans. Algae in the ocean is picking up 93 gigatons of carbon dioxide, but then when they die and get broken down, they're releasing 90 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, 800 gigatons. The amount taken up every year is about 210 gigatons by plants photosynthesizing. Humans are tipping the balance. So out of that 800 gigatons in the atmosphere, or the 210 gigatons being taken up by photosynthesis, humans have kicked in another 10 gigatons, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it's enough to disturb the balance. So humans have thrown the carbon balance out of balance, and now the atmosphere is accumulating more and more carbon dioxide, which is warming the atmosphere. For more information, here's the Keeling curve. Here's the annual pattern of as the trees drop their leaves, CO2 builds up, and then in summertime, everything goes nuts. All the trees leaf out, absorb lots of CO2, but the overall trend is up and up and up and up and up as a result of burning fossil fuels. Oh, I love this diagram. Evidence for present climate change. That's enough about the carbon budget. Let's talk about if you wanted to know that the climate was changing, what would you look at? If we were in class, we could talk. That'd be nice. If we got together and made a list of everything we could look at, like if the climate was changing, what would tell us? What would you want to look for? We could make that list, and then we could compare that list to what's actually happening and check off every single item. Okay. All right, wise guy. You think the climate is warming? Well, let's see. Is there higher temperature over the land? Yes. Higher temperature in the lower troposphere? Yes. Higher temperature in the air over the oceans? Yes. Warmer oceans? Yes. More heat content in the oceans? Yes. Higher temperatures over land and the ocean? Yes. Rising sea levels? Yes. Less ice in the ocean? Yes. Less ice on the land? Yes. Less snow cover on the land? Yes. More water vapor in the atmosphere? Yes. So every objective standard that you could use to determine if the climate is changing tells us that the climate's changing, and all the scientists are pretty much in agreement. It's because of humans burning fossil fuels. Temperatures, melting ice, rising sea level, more water vapor, higher temperatures. In fact, the only spot on here that really sticks out is right here. Slightly lower sea temperatures as a result of all of the melted ice flowing off of Greenland into the Atlantic. Here we're looking at temperatures from 1880 to the present. The 80s were the warmest decade ever recorded. That record was beat by the 90s. The 90s were then the warmest decade ever recorded. Every year was warmer than the 1980s average. The 2000s were even warmer. Every year in the 2000s was warmer than the 1990s. 2011 through 2015 were the 5 warmest years ever recorded. It's just warm and warm and warm. Melting ice, both on sea and on the land. Here we can compare the minimum ice in 2012 to the average sea ice, the average minimum since 2000. We've lost like at least half the ice half the sea ice. I've also included the most current animations from NASA of sea ice loss. And I should point out the sea ice, this is just ice floating in the water. It's not actually on anything. It's ice that floats in the water. And it turns out it's very important for polar bears. It's the multi-year ice. So what happens is the seawater gets very, very cold and it freezes. And when it freezes, the salt gets squeezed out. And so you get freshwater ice from ocean water. If that ice sticks around through the summer, next year, when it's cold again, that ice will get even thicker. And then if it sticks around, the next year it'll get thicker. So you can have multi-year ice, and that's the thick ice that the polar bears and the walruses hang out on. But that ice is almost completely gone. In the animation, when you see it, I think you'll be really surprised how much of the old thick ice we've lost. And now it's just the thin ice that formed this year. So the problem with that is because the ice is thinner, it's going to melt faster. So then you have water for more of the summer season. So the ocean gets warmer. So in the fall, it takes longer to in the fall, it takes longer to cool to form the ice. Because it takes longer to form, the ice is thinner, so it melts sooner in the summer. Because it melts sooner, the ocean gets warmer, so it freezes over later. So when it does freeze, it's thinner, so it melts faster. So it's another positive feedback loop. As the planet warms, we get less and less ice. Less and less sea ice. These are ice sheets. You can see the overall trend for Antarctica, the overall trend for Greenland. Greenland losing twice as much ice as Antarctica. In 2012, for the first time in recorded history, in mid-July, 97% of the whole surface was melting. And in the video, in the list of climate change videos, I've included one of tipping points in the Arctic. This is the ice elevation feedback loop. So because the ice is so thick, the top of the ice surface is very high. As you all know, it's cool to be high, so the top of the ice sheet is cold in part due to its high elevation. But as it melts, that elevation is getting lower and lower and lower as the ice melts. So the more the ice melts, the lower the elevation is of the surface, the warmer it is, the more it melts. The lower the surface is, the more it melts. The lower it is, the more it melts. So there's a positive feedback loop going on with the ice elevation feedback loop. I'll probably ask you, in fact, for sure, I'll ask you questions on that about the tipping points in the Arctic to explain them, to list them from the video, from the climate change videos on tipping points in the Arctic. Here we have some ice shelves. These are regions that have sea ice, enormous sheets of ice that are out floating in the ocean. They're beginning to break up, and as they break up, the ice that's on the land flows faster into the ocean, which raises sea level globally. Part of those, so the ice sheets in places that are grounded, they're actually grinding along the bottom of the ocean. But what's happening is these warm currents are coming in and melting them from the bottom. So the water is warmer, the air is warmer, but there's also these new warm currents that are melting back the grounding line, which then allows them to flow faster into the ocean. Melting ice. Permafrost is melting. This is Dr. Katie, in Anchorage in Alaska. She studies methane in lakes. There's roughly twice as much methane in the permafrost as there is in the atmosphere. That's melting. As it melts, microorganisms break down the organic material and release methane, which warms it. So that's another positive feedback loop. The permafrost methane feedback loop is another positive feedback loop. Here's another map showing all of the areas of permafrost and how much organic content is in the top 30 centimeters of soil. So like the top foot of soil. Regions showing where carbon dioxide is being released by melting permafrost across the Arctic. In gigatons, 10 gigatons released, while 1.0 gigatons are absorbed. So the permafrost is a source of methane, which is roughly 86 times more powerful than carbon dioxide at absorbing heat. How else do we know that the climate is changing? Rising sea levels. I think the best estimate by 2100 is going to be 6 feet. So for the test, whatever the book says, you should just ignore that and go with the 6 feet as the best estimate for sea level rise by 2100. I think this is Vanuatu, and this is the road that goes around the edge of the island. So this is the ocean, and it's just high tide, and the ocean is washing over the land in this island. There are island nations that are having to relocate. Everybody is having to find a new country to go to after living here for thousands of years. the ocean water comes up, so the fresh water is contaminated, so you don't have fresh water to drink, you don't have fresh water to grow crops anymore. So everybody's going to have to get off of these low-lying Pacific islands. Increasing water vapor, we've talked about that. This was Hurricane Patricia. The sustained winds were over 200 miles an hour. One of the most powerful storms ever seen on the planet. More water vapor, more heavy rain. So here we've got energy and sea surface temperature. In fact, one of the really interesting studies was done by a Republican climatologist named Kerry Emanuel of MIT. And he looked at sea surface temperature and the amount of energy in storms and found that from 1970 to the present, the amount of energy released by hurricanes has doubled every year. There aren't twice as many hurricanes, but the energy released by hurricanes has doubled from 1970 to the present. At the same time, there was a 1 Celsius degree increase in sea surface temperatures. And the interesting thing is, Emmanuel's a Republican and consistently says things like, "I'm a Republican. There's no hoax. This is actually what is happening. We are changing the climate, and it's us." Extreme events, heat waves. I think I've mentioned before, Australia and now the United States have had to add colors to their weather maps because they've never seen temperatures that high. So heat waves, droughts, floods, and increased heavy rain. In fact, this is what the future holds for many of us. The amount of rainfall might remain the same, but instead of having, let's just say, 7 storms throughout the winter, each of them bringing 2 or 3 inches of rain, now it could be 1 or 2 heavy precip flooding events followed by drought. Flood. Drought. Causes. Greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide, easily the most important. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and CFCs. So let's take a look at these 4 gases. Carbon dioxide, fossil fuels, a major source of carbon dioxide. Also making concrete. Concrete requires enormous amounts of fossil fuel. Methane from, for example, cows. As cows digest their food, they burp lots of methane. Turns out to be important. Natural gas and petroleum systems are the most important source of methane, with ag coming a close second. If we ate less meat, we could change the climate in a good way. Nitrous oxide from synthetic fertilizers. If we change the way we ate, we could change the climate in a good way. CFCs, things like Freon that were used in refrigerators, turn out to be incredibly harmful to the ozone layer as well as global warming. So you get a twofer. By phasing out the use of these gases, we are changing the climate in a good way. And that's one of the things that gives me hope was the Oslo Accord, when scientists realized that greenhouse gases were harming the ozone layer. There was an international agreement to phase out their use, and it looks like it's happening. Lots of countries that use lots of oil. Good job. Radiative forcing factors are forces that either make the planet warmer or cooler. So if we looked at everything, all the different factors that make either warmer or cooler, and assign them numbers in watts, we could look at greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide is going to be the most important, followed by methane. This is the graphic out of our textbook that shows the breakdown. So greenhouse gases and the warming or the cooling is expressed in watts per square meter. Watt is just a unit of energy. About 1,500 watts are a hairdryer. So greenhouse gases are warming the planet, air pollution slightly cooling, water vapor slightly warming, changes to ozone slightly cooling. Contrails, cirrus clouds, slightly warming. Black carbon, slightly warming. I was going to say the next slide should be, So this is from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, from their 4th assessment report, in which they were looking at all the factors expressed in watts per square meter. So here we've got carbon dioxide, the other greenhouse gases, all of those adding up to about 2.6 watts. So the average, the total warming from humans is about 2.4 watts per square meter. The total warming from humans, about 2.4 watts per square meter. The total warming from humans, about 2.4 watts per square meter. Some of the things we're doing are making it warmer, greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane. Some of the things like air pollution making it slightly cooler, but on the whole, warming the whole planet by 2.4 watts per square meter. So if we add it all together, what do we know? It's warmer. The sun isn't making a whole lot of energy right now. It's mainly humans. So looking at temperature models, the black line is what really happened, and the red line is what the computer models said should have happened based on changes of insolation, changes in temperature due to volcanic activity, changes to temperature due to El Nino, changes to temperature from greenhouse gases. You can see greenhouse gases, it's just warming and warming and warming. Volcanic activity making it cooler. I'll talk more about that when I talk about models, the temperature models or the computer models used to predict climate, to study climate. They're sometimes called nested grid models. So they make a grid over the surface and then make multiple layers going up through the atmosphere, multiple layers going through the ocean, and then they change the conditions and see how that affects temperature. And then they change conditions and see how that changes temperature, and change conditions and see how that changes temperature. So each of these boxes at the surface, up through the atmosphere, down through the ocean, they're looking at the temperature, the air pressure, humidity, wind speed and direction, the cloud type, and water temperature and currents for that box. And then they change that box and see how that box's change affects the changes around it. And they change all the boxes once. And then they do it again and again and again and again and again. And the good news is that the computer models are getting much more accurate. The resolution, the scale. So looking in the model at the book, you can see the size of this square is bigger than the ones on the land. But that's generally happening with the computer models, is the squares, the processing squares are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So when I first started, one square would have covered most of the western United States. And now, like, one square is part of San Francisco and a whole bunch of squares over is Sacramento. So they're able to differentiate on a much smaller spatial scale to show how the temperature would be different. The temperature and rainfall would be different from Sacramento to San Francisco, instead of looking at everything west of the Rockies as, well, it's just, this is the change. It's going to be the same for this whole area. Oh, another way of thinking of that is like video games, that the early video games, the pixels were way bigger. And as computers have gotten more powerful, the video game rendering engines have gotten more and more realistic. Well, the same thing's happening with the climate models. The climate models are getting more powerful. They're getting more accurate, which is good. The bad news is what they have to tell us. Here's just a rando picture of supercomputers at NASA. The most powerful computers in the world are used to run climate models. So looking at the climate model using just natural changes, and the black line is what really happened, the red was the models, everything breaks down after 1960. If you include natural changes and human changes, then you get really good agreement, the whole thing, good agreement, including the dip of Mount Pinatubo. That was very, very important, is they were able to accurately model the changes to temperature based on the eruption of Mount Pinatubo. So these are the representative concentration pathways, the RCP. The RCP numbers, and this is one of those review questions. Hey, what are the numbers in the RCP numbers? It's warming in watts per square meter. So a little while ago, we were looking at the radiative forcings, and I said, hey, humans overall are warming the planet by 2.4 watts. So here we have 4 RCPs, 2.6, 4.5, 6, and 8. 8.5, 2.6, 4.5, 6, and 8.5. And the reason for all of these simulations is that the scientists know what the climate system does, but the scientists don't know what humans are going to do. So the RCP 2.6, 6, 8.5, 4.5, those are all based on different societal choices. So it's not that the scientists don't understand the problem, it's that the scientists don't know what humans are going to do. So the 2.6 would be like if everybody on the planet woke up tomorrow and said, oh my God, global warming is real. We need to stop it. So we're not going to use any more fossil fuels. We're going to invest heavily in renewable resources. And we are going to keep the warming to 2.6 watts. Remember, right now we're at 2.4 watts. And the temperatures over time would gradually stabilize. The 8.5 is often called the business as usual model, and that's the nobody pays any attention to global warming and we keep doing what we're doing. This was designed to be the worst case scenario, but the models actually underestimated how much fossil fuels humans would use. So the actual pace of warming is worse than the 8.5, which would be 8.5 watts of warming by 2100, which would lead to a warming in temperatures by about 8 degrees. That's a global average. That 8 Fahrenheit is a global average. The warming in the Arctic and the high latitudes is going to be double what it is in the tropics, which is an important spatial aspect, that the tropics aren't going to change temperature as fast. The mid-latitudes and high latitudes are going to change a great deal. So here's another map or another figure showing the same thing, the RCP 2.5 resulting in 8 degrees by 2100, the RCP 6.0, 4.5, and the 2.6 isn't even on here. But currently we're burning more, we're off the chart of the 8.5. The 8.5 results in the parts of the Arctic being 20 degrees warmer by 2080 or so. Oh, yeah. So I included this picture. This is a picture of Earth as it would have looked about 20,000 years ago. 20,000 years ago, temperatures were 5 to 8 degrees cooler. So one of the things that humans have a very hard time with is knowing what to do with the information from the scientists. So the scientists say things like, well, it's going to be 8 degrees warmer by 2100. And humans say, I don't know what that means. I mean, I know what 8 degrees difference in temperature. I would know what clothes to wear if you tell me what the temperature is. But if you tell me it's 8 degrees warmer, is that a big deal? Is that not a big deal? I don't know. So 5 to 8 degrees colder means you've got a mile of ice over Chicago. 5 to 8 degrees colder means you've got a mile of ice over Chicago. Much of Europe is encased in ice. There was solid ice over Iceland and Greenland. In fact, you could walk all the way from North America up to Greenland because there was so much ice. So 5 to 8 degrees cooler means a mile of ice over Chicago. We're going 5 to 8 degrees warmer than the present, so the changes are probably going to be equally dramatic in terms of warming and changes in where crops can be grown, changes in where insects now live, changes in what regions have floods and droughts as a result of changes to temperature and evaporation. One of the things we have to look forward to is massive sea level rise. Part of sea level rise is just due to what's called thermal expansion. So some of the sea level rise is because the glaciers are melting and the water's running off into the ocean. Part of the sea level rise is because as the seawater warms, it expands slightly. So thermal expansion is a big part of sea level rise, and the other part, most of it is due to runoff, glacial runoff. But I think roughly a quarter, a third, is due to thermal expansion. So places like New Orleans, places like Miami will be underwater shortly, 2100 or so. Sea level rise, again, 6 feet by 2100 is the number that I think is most realistic. Oh, this is interesting. They've got different, so RCP 2.6, 4.5, 8.5, different RCPs, different representative concentration pathway models resulting in different sea level rises. So looking at the 8.5, they were saying maybe 8 feet. Yeah, I think 6 feet for sure. 6 feet for sure by 2100. Oh, this was New York City during Hurricane Sandy. That's just the ocean lapping up at this park. New York City is going to spend a couple $1 billion to prevent further damage from further storms, from future higher sea level, future larger storms. And that's a really important point. is mitigation and adaptation. As the climate changes, we're going to have to respond to it if we don't want to get flattened by it. So things like higher sea levels or bigger storms mean that humans are going to have to deal with it. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, won a Nobel Prize for their efforts to understand climate change. They keep producing reports. They've said the same thing every single report. They're working on the latest report right now that's going to say exactly the same thing, which is we're changing the climate and it's going to be really bad. It's also important to point out that we're changing the climate. It's going to be bad. The orange places are drier. Oh, drier. The IPCC. This was the Paris Agreement. The Trump administration pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord. That would have been a wonderful thing if we had stayed in it, but we didn't. There is virtually no actual disagreement of scientists about climate change. This is one study of studies I found of almost 14,000 studies, 24 rejected global warming. I've read a couple different studies now that are reanalyses of these 24 that reject global warming. One study I read of went back and looked at the studies that rejected global warming, and in every single study, there were problems with the study that resulted in they couldn't reproduce it. So one of the things about science, the way science works is science should be reproducible. If I tell you how I did an experiment, you should be able to do the same experiment and come up with the same results. But in the papers that are denying global warming, they were crappy papers. And so when the scientists went back to try to redo those experiments, they couldn't do it because the original work was crappy. So this is a political issue. It's an ideological issue. I think it's impossible to be a Republican these days without also being believing a whole set of things. And so it's very difficult to separate out one of those issues, even if you are a scientist and you recognize global warming is happening because of humans. Studies have showed that if it's cold, fewer people believe that global warming is happening, but it's getting warmer. Things that we could do, we could change our agricultural systems. If we did smaller scale organic agriculture, that would capture, actually, if we changed the way we did agriculture and adopted organic agriculture, that could absorb all the CO2 people are putting out. I'll find the YouTube video that talked about organic, sustainable, regenerative, restorative agriculture and how it captures carbon. The other idea is called geoengineering, and that is the idea that because humans didn't understand the climate system and we've messed it up, the solution clearly has to be that humans have to mess it up even more. So we're going to put reflectors in orbit. We're going to put giant space umbrellas. We're going to make chemtrails. We're going to put chemicals in jet fuel that make the exhaust white and more reflective. We're going to fertilize the ocean so that algae will grow, that will absorb carbon dioxide, then die and sink to the bottom. Pumping CO2, this is sequestration of carbon. David Wallace Wells talks about this. This is negative emissions technology. This right here is the negative emissions technology. Somehow, probably at the power plant, they're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and liquefying it, making the gas into a liquid that they pump into rocks and hope it stays there forever, instead of coming up in some sort of massive climate destabilizing burp. We'll see. We'll see what happens. What can you do? Overthrow the government? Get rid of fossil fuels? As an individual, there's not much you can do. You have been lied to consistently by the fossil fuel industry that wants to make you feel bad and helpless. So yeah, you should turn down your air conditioning. You should turn down your heater. You should take shorter showers. But really, that's not going to save the planet. It's going to require international action, international coordinated action to save the planet. And there's a link to a Rolling Stone article on sea level rise, indicating it's more of a problem than we realized. That's it for Chapter 7 on climate change. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please let me know. That's it, and I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.